is going on, Inflation Nation? It's your boy, Flay, City, coming at you with another video. Talking about building a PC in this new environment that is coming to all of us. Now, here's the thing. Google recently released a tweet, so it seems like a lot of people are starting to get worried about it. But fear not, tech citizens, let's join on this ship together and we will steer it clear of all the icebergs. And now, when we look at this analogy, right, we're going to look at the ship steering through the icebergs. We're going to call the person in the ship who's not educated, they don't know where the icebergs lie. So they're just sailing blindly and they could just crash with ease. But at least if we sit down and we all discuss this in the comments and we educate ourselves going forward, we'll at least kind of know where those icebergs lie so we can steer clear of them and at least keep ourselves safe in this weird forthcoming environment. But you know, I sat back and I had this PC build ready to go. And what I got to do from here on in is I got to go pick up a RGB case where I can get one for 55 Aussie dollars. And it got me thinking, well, there's a trend that I'm already starting to see within the results. The first thing is that the government's grossly, at least in Australia, grossly underreporting inflation figures. I think the same's happening in the USA. Where, you know, I went down the bakery, for instance, the other day. They just upped prices by 10%. 10%. Like, didn't even go for 5%. Just across the line, all the prices went up 10%. And then I asked them, why'd you guys up the prices? And then they said to me, well, the prices of the stuff that we have to source is all going up. And it's going up pretty quickly, so we've got to pass that on. And of course, the demand is there because all this confetti money is flowing through the economy. Now, the first crucial thing to look at with inflation is actually a consequence and a negative factor related to inflation itself, and that is uncertainty. This is what inflation brings about, at least from everything that I've researched in history. And now another important factor relating to enthusiast tech products is that since we've known enthusiast tech, it's always been priced as the baseline in United States dollars, which was the world reserve currency, and we also haven't been in an environment of high inflation. Say, for instance, from the 1990s to 2020, inflation was relatively low. So going forward, there's that extra element of uncertainty which is added to enthusiast tech products. And so what do we do when it comes to building a PC in relation to inflation? Well, there's only one thing that we can do, and that is try and get the deals. But what constitutes a deal now that our baseline is being inflated with uncertainty? Well, we're going to have to start thinking out of the box here in terms of pricing our PC parts in relative terms. And so what I'm proposing here is a system known as relative worth outside of dollars, where I know for a fact I got really good deals on all these parts. Even though the main component of the build, the RX 570, that cost me 120 Aussie dollars. And this is a used card from a miner. About 8 months ago, this card here would have cost me around 100 Aussie dollars, however, and now this graphics card cost me $120. And you're probably thinking, well, Brian, it's gone up 20% in 9 months. That's higher than the inflation rates. But if we look at another metric, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the video, it's actually a really good deal. So let's go now pick up this final component, which is the case. And while I'm on the road, I'm just going to build this thing up in nature and get some peaceful vibes. So we picked up the case and we were going to build this at this really nice location, but then as we got to the location, I realized I forgot my screwdriver. So now I had to run back home and then grab the screwdriver, and now we've got all the parts. And so we're going to miss the sunset if we end up going back to that location. It's like a half an hour drive. So I've just gone down to a local location, which is only like 2 minutes down the road, and this will have to suffice.
You've permanently increased the size of government too.
Inflation. to run around this building like chooks with their head chopped off, saying it was a disaster.
You've permanently increased the size of government too.
Inflation.
They used to run around this building like chooks with their head chopped off, saying it was a disaster.
You've permanently increased the size of government too.
Inflation.
A disaster.
Inflation.
And we've just finished this PC in the nick of time as the sun does indeed set on this beautiful day. But we can also think of this sunset almost like the beginning of something, the beginning of inflation. So as inflation sets upon us, we now have to think of new strategies going forward. So it's now early in the morning the next day, and I've actually had to change over the motherboard because this motherboard right here is just completely gone. Has no signal whatsoever. But what we got right here is an awesome little build for the money, and you're probably thinking, well, Brian, you had to change the motherboard over, and that's going to cost you a little bit more. And the thing is, I got this in a whole lot deal with all the graphics cards, and I mean, I think I paid like $50 for these a heap of different motherboards that were untested. So I expect for that $50, even if one of them with the CPU and RAM worked, I was still coming out on top. So this board not working at all doesn't really bother me that much. And in fact, we're gonna now start pricing up this stuff right here to, in 2021, I think going forward, we're gonna need to know what constitutes an actual deal, because I'm pretty sure people will be in certain areas of the world, their whole pricing radar will be in complete disarray. So when your pricing radar is in complete disarray, what is another step you can take to get around this disarray? And so if we look at the price of copper over the last year especially, it's actually gone up maybe 50-60% on average. And so if we get the average price of 2020 and then compare that to the average ongoing price of 2021, we can see that that will give us a baseline to then compare to the price of a graphics card. So if we look at, this is a basic concept here, but you'll start seeing the gist of it. If the average price of an RX 570 for me in Australia locally here was around 100 Aussie dollars, that means me paying $120 would actually be considered a solid deal in 2021, because the manufacturers will need metals and everything else. I think you'll find if you relate the price of copper to other commodities, you'll find that other commodities have gone up at the same price increase and the same momentum. And so what we can do with copper, just keeping it simple and bringing it back to basics, is that maybe this graphics card, this RX 570, if it was around $150, if I paid $150 for it, that would be considered maybe a fair deal, just based on the price of a metal such as copper. So now that I've got that in the back of my mind, I can then start to price up PC parts as I'm going forward to know if I'm now getting ripped off in 2021 versus getting a good deal. But if we look at something like an RTX 3060 Ti, for instance, that's going for $1,100 US, where when it first came out, it was going for around maybe $399, $450. And so if we look at that pricing model, we can see that the most you should really be paying for a 3060 Ti, which should be around $650 US. Yet paying $1,100 USD for them, when all things are considered, you're basically buying into a bubble. And that's been my opinion on that. And I've sort of had to figure out a way of pricing up that graphics card and saying, okay, this is why I think if you're paying X amount for a 3060 Ti, you're buying into a bubble. So coming back to this RX 570, in my head, I've priced this thing at around 150 Aussie dollars, but that would be for one on the market that's working. This here, I did come into this deal having to take on the risk, knowing that it couldn't work. And in fact, I had to spend all the extra time doing other things like testing it to making sure it works, changing the thermal paste. So I'd say even then, after we factor out those things, I would have got a fair deal. And now here we are at conclusion time with this PC right here. It's running absolutely fine. It's quiet. The case that I got off someone on the Gold Coast, he runs his little local computer business called Sysnex. It's actually funny. The story with him was really cool, where he knew about the YouTube, the Tech Yes YouTube, a while ago, and I picked up a deal off him, and then he realized, okay, wow, he can flip PCs and do all this sort of thing, and he got into it and he really enjoyed it, and that was the main thing. So now he's got a computer business where he services computers, builds computers, and it's really good to see a lot of people sort of building up this PC community. But getting back on topic with PC parts and what's going to happen going forward, that is, there's going to be pricing distortions. So if we take a look at something like the price of copper, for instance, that has had a massive swing in volatility, where it's gone from in the $2 range per pound on copper all the way up to now nearly $5 a pound. And so those pricing distortions, they cause ultimately disruptions in the pipeline, where companies that rely on commodities then have to suddenly adjust their prices and make things more expensive. And so of course, when that all rolls through the pipeline, you only see nothing but increased prices. But at least if you look at the price of raw commodities, you can then relate that back to the price increases that we've seen on certain components, such as graphics cards, and you'll realize, okay, well, graphics cards are definitely overvalued, even if we put in that buffer that we talked about before. But on the flip side, if we then relate that to other products in circulation, say for instance a motherboard, RAM, SSDs, and all this other stuff, we can see that they're actually, I believe, some of these components are undervalued, especially if we look at used parts, where some of the other parts besides the graphics cards that I picked up in that deal, where I was getting 3 motherboards and 3 CPUs and all this DDR3 RAM for $50, that's an extremely good deal. And in fact, me being a deal hunter and ultimately flipping PCs, I'm going to be stocking up on stuff that's cheap and nobody wants. And so me, of course, loving a good bargain and a good deal, when I see things like 3 motherboards and all this DDR3 memory and 3 CPUs, for instance, these, even this motherboard here, this had an i5 4590 in it, and it doesn't really matter that the motherboard doesn't work. The i5 itself, coupled in with 2 other motherboards that work, is a really good deal. So 3 functional CPUs and 2 functional motherboards and a heap of DDR3 memory, that's a no-brainer to jump on that deal. But of course, with graphics cards being so in demand from cryptocurrency miners, it's easy to see why people think the graphics cards would be the better deal based on the market price of what these graphics cards are going for. But that's why I've said before, I think the graphics cards will come down in price sooner or later, because they're just simply too overvalued for what they are at this point in time. The final thing to talk about, where we relate the price of a commodity to that of a PC part, is something where we actually have a very strong correlation here. Even though I haven't done in-depth research on it, at least from what I've studied so far, when we look at tech products and something like copper, the strong correlation there is that over time, both the price of copper and even the price of tech products have easily been tied to things like economies of scale and more efficient technologies used in that field, which helps drive prices down. Now, when we look at the economies of scale and also the efficiencies that are introduced, so when we look at the price of copper in the 1960s, we see it was pretty much under $1. Now, are we going back to that pricing? No, because of inflation. Though when we look at the 1960s, since then, mining companies would have used more efficient trucks, they would have had bigger drills, better processes, and that would have driven the cost down. And so when people talk about deflationary pressures that exist going forward, they're talking about economies of scale and more efficient processes used to drive prices down. And then when we apply this same argument to tech products, we can see that the same thing is happening. Over time, there's more CPUs being made, there's more GPUs being made, so the scale of production has increased drastically, especially when it comes to tech enthusiast products, and this has helped in ways drive the prices down, believe it or not. But of course, the hidden factor there that not many people are talking about, inflation, has always existed to keep prices relatively the same, at least over the last 10 to 20 years. But looking forward from here on in, when it comes to PC parts and pricing, I'm going to actually start throwing in something into the equation, a third factor, and I think the price of copper may just be the best bet. And I'd love to hear you guys, your thoughts and opinions on this. And when we tie this back to mainstream media, they're going to tell us, and they're going to keep telling us, that everything is in a shortage, when in fact all these factories, their production levels have been the highest they've ever been. Yet we've got to get to the real issue, and that is the dollar itself is going down in value because there's a massive oversupply of dollars. And so naturally the nominal prices have to go up. But if we then introduce another element into the equation, that will then give us a better understanding of what's going on. So hopefully this whole concept has sort of, I feel like it's necessary going forward because I'm personally seeing a lot of disruptions going on in my life and around me. And a lot of people are calling me up behind the scenes and like, Brian, yo, what do I do? Help me out here. And I'm trying to tell them, look, I don't believe, like in Australia, for example, the governments are telling us prices have only increased 0.6%. 0.6%. I mean, I just have to go down to my bakery and see that they've jacked the prices up 10% to know that this is a complete fallacy in how they're calculating their numbers, or they're simply lying.
I smell the bullshit.
And with that aside, we have the question of the day here, which comes from Midpoint, and they ask, is this Linus's dad? Come on, man, like, come on. From what I checked Linus's date of birth, and he's 34 years old. I'm only like literally 9 months older than Linus. But perhaps Midpoint has a point, and that's why I was going down to the park and building a PC to de-stress. But in terms of me being Linus's dad, to answer the question directly, yes, I am Linus's dad. So make sure you subscribe to Papa Yes and ring that bell, hit that like, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.